Hi everyone, I'm Jonathan Fabrey. I'm a school counselor with over 20 years in education, and today I'll be walking you through a recent due process hearing from the Palisades School District here in Pennsylvania. This isn't just a legal case, it's a story about trust, leadership, and how we apply special education law in real life situations. The decision was issued by hearing officer James Garrell in March 2025, and it offers valuable lessons for school leaders, educators, and families alike. Before we get into the specifics of the case, let me give you a brief overview of the legal framework that governs everything we're about to discuss. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, is the cornerstone of special education law in the United States. It ensures that students with disabilities are entitled to a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, in the least restrictive environment possible. That means schools have a legal obligation to identify, evaluate, and support individuals with disabilities based on their individual needs. One key aspect of IDEA is the reevaluation process. Under 34 CFR Section 300.303, schools are required to reevaluate students at least once every 3 years to determine whether they can still qualify for special education-related services, and whether their current IEP is meeting their needs. However, reevaluations can happen more frequently if conditions warrant it, or if a parent or teacher requests one. These evaluations must be comprehensive, use technically sound instruments, and be administered by trained professionals. And here's where it can get complicated. Parental consent is required for most evaluations, including reevaluations. If a parent refuses, IDEA Section 300.300 allows the school district to seek permission through due process. That's what happened in this case, and that's the heart of the issue. How far should a district go when one parent consents to a reevaluation and the other parent refuses? Also relevant to this case is the IEE, or Independent Educational Evaluation. Under Section 300.502 of IDEA, if a parent disagrees with the district's evaluation, they have the right to request an IEE at public expense. However, they can't request it prematurely. The district must be given the first opportunity to evaluate the student. If the parent disagrees with those results, that's when an IEE becomes a valid procedural safeguard. In my earlier paper on IEEs, I talked about how these evaluations can serve as a check and balance mechanism when trust breaks down between families and schools, but they're also a signal, a way for families to say, we don't feel heard. And when we ignore that message, we risk damaging relationships that are essential for collaboration. So with all that context, let's dig into the actual case. You'll see how these legal requirements played out, what the hearing officer decided, and why I believe this case goes beyond compliance and speaks directly to the kind of leadership we need in special education today. This case centers on a student, referred to as CG, who is receiving speech therapy under an IEP for a specific learning disability, but was otherwise fully included in general education and earning straight A's. The school suspected they might no longer need special education services and sought to consent to conduct a reevaluation. The father agreed, but the mother didn't say anything until the actual testing started, and then the mother called and refused testing. The district, believing the evaluation was essential, filed for due process to override her lack of consent. The hearing officer ultimately ruled in favor of the district. To understand the context, CG had been receiving minimal services for a specific learning disability, speech therapy once per 6-day cycle while participating in general education classes. Since May 2024, they had been earning A's and meeting or exceeding IEP goals. The IEP team recommended exiting them from special education, but at the father's request, they postponed that decision until the start of this next school year. Then, in September, the district sought reevaluation with a plan that included ability and achievement testing. The father signed, the mother didn't respond, despite several attempts. The mother's resistance was deeply rooted in mistrust. She believed the district had already made up its mind and that the reevaluation was merely performative. She also prematurely requested an independent educational evaluation, or IEE, which is only allowed after a district completes its own evaluation as per IDEA section 300.502, subsection B, paragraph 1, and PPV Westchester 2009. But the real breakdown came when the district's special education case manager told CG directly that they didn't need an IEP and was using services meant for other students. That statement was completely inappropriate and, in my view, cost the district its credibility. Legally, the district was on firm ground. They documented multiple attempts to gain consent, paused testing when the mother objected, and used a qualified psychologist. Their main purpose was to verify the continued eligibility of the student and to support transitions if necessary. They relied on Title 34 Code of Federal Regulations, IDEA, Section 300.303, to support the need for reevaluation, and filed for due process under Section 300.300, subsection 3, paragraph 2. Their argument was clear. Reevaluation was needed to determine whether CG remained eligible and what supports they might still need. The IDEA permits reevaluation at least every 3 years and sooner if needed. If a parent refuses, the district can go to due process to override that refusal. Evaluations must be comprehensive and administered by trained professionals. According to Rights law, districts can't be expected to make appropriate decisions without access to updated, valid data. That's what the district was trying to gather. Hearing officer James Garrell agreed with the district. He ruled that they had a valid reason to suspect CG might no longer qualify for special education and proposed a legally sound evaluation plan. However, he also found the case manager's statements to be outrageous and a violation of the collaborative spirit IDEA demands, citing Schaefer v. Wiest, 2005. He ordered that the reevaluation include a formal assessment of how the case manager's comment might have emotionally impacted the student and whether it affected her eligibility or created new service needs. The ruling allowed the district to proceed with the evaluation, but mandated that they include a social-emotional analysis of the harm done by the inappropriate comment. This emphasized that a legally sound plan isn't enough. Compliance must be coupled with care. I agree with the ruling. The district followed the legal process. They had data to justify the reevaluation, but legality isn't the whole story. As someone with 25 years in education, I believe the incident with the case manager reveals a bigger issue, one of leadership and trust. When a student is told they're undeserving of support, that's more than a procedural misstep. It undermines the whole IEP process. Let's take a step back and think about what we can learn from this case, not just legally, but practically. What can school leaders, counselors, and educators do to prevent these conflicts before they escalate to due process? First, we need to document and communicate clearly with both parents. This seems obvious, but it's often overlooked. In this case, the father was supportive of the reevaluation, but the mother wasn't. That disagreement created confusion and delay. If we want to ensure fairness and avoid misunderstandings, every communication, notice, and consent form must be shared with all legal guardians, and those interactions should be documented every step of the way. It's not just a compliance issue, it's a trust-building strategy. Second, staff must never speak directly to students about eligibility decisions, period. What happened in this case, a staff member telling the student they didn't need services and was taking them from others, was completely unacceptable. That moment did real damage, not just to the student's confidence, but to the district's credibility. Conversations about eligibility and service decisions belong in IEP meetings, not in passing comments between classes. Third, mistrust damages collaboration. Once the relationship between the mother and the district broke down, everything got harder. Communication stalled, assumptions were made, and what could have been a collaborative reevaluation turned into a legal battle. IDEA is built on the assumption that parents and schools work together. When the partnership breaks down, the entire process suffers, and the student is the one caught in the middle. Finally, use mediation or facilitated IEP meetings proactively. These tools aren't just for when things are falling apart. They can also be used as a preventative step to get everyone on the same page, surface concerns early, and keep the focus on the student. In fact, the hearing officer in this case recommended exactly that, and I fully agree. When conflict is starting to simmer, bringing in a neutral facilitator can make all the difference. These 4 lessons are simple but powerful. They remind us that compliance is only half the job. The other half is how we communicate, how we build trust, and how we show families that we're partners, not opponents, in supporting their children. So here's what I want to leave you with. How do we safeguard trust in our schools? We know that trust isn't built through procedural compliance alone. It's built through relationships, transparency, and how we treat families when things get difficult. When a parent pushes back, do we double down on our authority, or do we lean into partnership? In this case, the mother's mistrust didn't come out of nowhere. It grew from perception that the district had already made up its mind and escalated after a harmful comment was made to her child. That's a powerful reminder. One careless statement can undo months or even years of collaboration. Now the second question. When do we push for reevaluation, and when do we pause? Legally, the district had every right to pursue this reevaluation, but just because we can doesn't always mean we should, at least not without exhausting every opportunity to resolve things collaboratively first. Could a facilitated IEP meeting have helped? Could voluntary supports like an IEE or a neutral third party have changed the tone? These are leadership decisions. They require judgment, humility, and a willingness to do what's right, not just what's allowed. So I'd love to hear from you. How do you approach these moments? What have you seen work when relationships are strained, and how can we, as leaders, create school cultures where trust is the norm, not the exception? If I were principal, I would have offered to fund an IEE. It's not legally required, but IDEA permits it, and doing so could have de-escalated the situation. According to Rodriguez and Morawski, trust is foundational. Voluntarily offering an IEE shows families that the district is committed to fairness, not just winning a case. I'd also make clear to staff, students should never be pulled into conversations about eligibility outside of IEP meetings. This case shows that you can win the legal argument but lose the family's trust, and once that's gone, every interaction becomes harder. In my experience with IEEs, I think it's important to emphasize how this process offers a procedural safeguard for families who feel unheard, but that's not enough. The system also has to feel fair. That's why I'd support more use of mediation and facilitated IEP meetings, not just when conflict is high, but just as a preventative step. IDEA is designed to be collaborative, not adversarial. Let's talk about how we rebuild trust after a breakdown like this. First, acknowledge the harm. Second, show humility. Offering an IEE is one way. Third, invite parent input into how the evaluation is structured. Fourth, follow through on every commitment. And finally, keep students out of adult-level policy decisions. Our goal should be to repair, not win. To wrap up, the Palisades v. CG case reminds us that due process hearings aren't just about legal compliance. They're about relationships, communication, and trust. The district followed IDEA procedures and ultimately prevailed, but the breakdown in communication with the mother and the inappropriate staff comment nearly derailed the process. This case reinforces a core truth in special education. When trust erodes, even well-intentioned actions can be misinterpreted. As educators and leaders, we must strive to blend compliance with compassion. Clear documentation, respectful communication, and proactive collaboration are essential, not just for avoiding conflict, but for truly centering the needs of the students. Thank you.